We recommend this product be installed by a competent gunsmith.
Modification of your firearm may nullify the warranty of the firearm's manufacturer.
No liability is expressed or implied for damage or injury which may occur from improper use or installation of this product.
You are responsible for the safe handling, legalities, and use of your firearm.
Warning: always wear safety glasses when working on firearms.
Hi guys, welcome back to another exciting installation video from Apex Tactical Specialties. Today we're going to be installing our new Competition Action Enhancement Kit into the Ruger Mark IV series pistols. The new version of this kit reduces trigger pull to right around 3 pounds, reduces over travel by up to 80% when you adjust it properly per this video, and reduces overall trigger travel by roughly 25%. The best thing is the new version of this kit works in both the Ruger Mark IV and the Mark IV 2245 series, one kit for both pistols. Tools needed for this installation are a roll of tape. We're actually going to use tape this time, not just use it as a bench block. A hammer, a pair of needle nose pliers, and in this case I have two 16th-inch hex or Allen wrenches on hand. I have an L-shaped one that has a short leg. I need that for adjusting the trigger over travel stop. And I have a longer one that's a precision ground one that I use for everything else. I prefer these for everything, but I have to use the L-shape for the adjustment, so I typically like to have both. A Torx T-10. In this case, it's for the grip screws. Your frame might have different grip screws, so you may have to adjust which one you have, check your gun, and figure out what you've got. A 3/32 inch pin punch. In this case, it's just a flat end punch, and that's all we need. You can go up to 1/8 inch if you need to. And we also have a 1/16 inch pin punch here. This one has a little tip on it for a coil pin, but it's not necessary for this operation. It's just kind of a wedge for things as needed. And then a driver for those as well. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the grip screws from the left side of the frame. And once I pull that grip panel off, I want to point out the bolt release. The bolt release pivots off of the top grip screw escutcheon. So what I do is I pivot the front end of it down to bring the back up, and I slide it off. You'll notice there's a fork on the back that catches the bolt release on the outside of the frame. We'll do the left side first to get that out of the way, flip it over, take the other grip off, and continue on. After taking the grip panels off, the first thing we need to do is detension the hammer. I want you to notice the trigger bar itself, this little guy sticking up here, is our disconnector. So with my thumb safety off, if I hold the trigger bar down and I pull the trigger, hammer doesn't move, it does not fire. So what I need to do is I need to hold the hammer down when I pull the trigger, but there's also magazine safety. So I'm gonna take my empty magazine, I'm gonna go ahead and insert it into the grip until it seats properly, all the way in. Thumb safety off as it is now, and I'm going to put my thumb over the hammer, and you gotta hold some tension because this thing's under a lot of force. Pull the trigger and allow the hammer to come up and detension all the way. With my trigger held down, the hammer should free float right around here. And that's exactly what I'm looking for to make sure it's detensioned and out of the way. From here, we'll go ahead and take off the thumb safety paddles. For a fair portion of our disassembly, we're gonna go ahead and leave the magazine in the frame. You'll see why in just a few minutes. But the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and take off the right side thumb safety. This is using my 16th inch custom ground hex wrench and to pull that screw out of there. Once I get that guy out, all I have to do is lift up the thumb safety. Should just pop right off of there, come on. If I had smaller fingers, this would be a lot easier. There we go. Pop that guy out, set it aside. Now, there are two little tangs sticking out that engage the right side thumb safety. When I turn this over, I'm gonna press my finger against those to push the whole shaft and the left side thumb safety out. But keep in mind, there's a plunger right inside of here with a spring pointing about that direction. If I push this guy up without capturing that spring and plunger, I'm gonna launch that spring out there and I might lose it. So when I go to push that guy out, I'm gonna put my thumb or finger across the back end and I'll come up from the other side and I'll push the axle outward, pull it up and try to catch that spring and plunger as it comes up. So I'll move my hand here and I'll push that guy up as far as I can. And in this case, I push that as far as I can. So I'm gonna use my pin punch from the back side and press on that axle and push it out further. There we go. Now that's out far enough, I can scoot it out and now I can see the plunger and spring here. Hopefully you haven't lost those. If you lose them, you gotta find new parts. But that should keep you from losing them by keeping your finger on the end. So from here, I'll put a little bit of tension down on the hammer just to kind of hang on to it. And then I'll go ahead and pull that axle all the way out of the frame. From here, you'll have a little bit of tension from the magazine safety and you'll feel it kind of relieve itself. And once it's there, we'll continue the rest of the disassembly. Up until this point, we've kept the factory magazine in the frame. And the reason for that is it's taking tension off our Sear. If I had that out, if I had the magazine out and I left the Sear to do its own thing, when I detension the hammer itself or take the axle out, it wants to shoot the whole mechanism out of the frame toward me, which sounds great and all, but then it's how you lose parts. So from here, I should be able to pull the hammer and axle system out of the frame. I have to pull it up on the trigger bar, pull it out of the notch, set it aside, and then from here I can also kind of turn over and drop out my thumb safety plate. At this point, I'll go ahead and pull the magazine and the rest of the components, but I'll show you that next. With my hammer assembly out of the frame, first thing I need to do is take out the trigger return spring and plunger. When I roll the frame up, you can see that little plunger and spring kind of right inside there. I'm just gonna go ahead and turn the frame over, try to dump those guys out of there. If they don't dump out, I'll use my pliers and pull the plunger and spring out. Oh, there goes the plunger. Use my pin punch to get that spring. And the reason I do this now is because I don't want to go launching those across the room and have to go do the gunsmith hunt on my hands and knees looking for parts. Once those are out of the way, now I can detension the sear. The sear is this little silver guy right inside of here. As it is now, the magazine body is holding the sear from flipping all the way around toward the rear of the gun. So what I want to do is I'm going to put my finger inside the frame on the sear. I'm going to push forward ever so slightly on that, take up the tension. With that tension relieved, I'm going to pop the mag out, let that fall out of the way. From here, I can gradually relieve tension on the sear until it's free floating in the frame. Now it's not flipping all around and wanting to jump out at me. At this point, I'll use my pin punch and I'll just push the sear pin all the way out. You hear it pop out, and then I can dump the sear and sear spring out of the frame. Now all I have to do is take the trigger out and we're ready to reassemble. Before I can remove my trigger body, I have to remove the trigger pin. The trigger pin itself has a little ring machine on it. You can kind of see it right here, right below my Allen wrench, just kind of straight down. There's a spring, this little guy right here, that's tensioning it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on top of my roll of tape. I'm going to lay it down. I'm going to punch that pin from the right side. I have to give it a couple of good sharp whacks to get it to overcome the spring. Then it'll come right out. So we'll do that next. We're going to go ahead and punch out our trigger pivot pin. Now, I'm using my 3/32 inch pin punch. Up to an 1/8 inch will work just fine. You want to use a flat tip punch so you don't damage your pin. I prefer to tap these from the left side of the frame to the right through the frame. Seems to come out better that way. So I'm going to position the pin near the edge of the inside of the tape, right over here, so that I've got the most support. Put my pin on that guy, give it a couple of whacks to get it free. Oh, there it goes. And pop it right out. The spring detent will oftentimes hold it, so sometimes you have to give it a good whack to get it to move. Once that's done, I'll move that out of the way. My trigger and bar can come right out, and then my bolt release assembly can come out as well. Now, here's where we need to find the spring. If you look in the front of the frame, there's a little spring right down in this crevasse. I'm going to use my pin to pull that guy out, if I can. Actually, I can go in like that and pull it right out. Don't lose that spring. You're going to need it later. Set it aside. Just want to give you a close-up of the bolt release spring. On the front left side of the frame, there's a little opening here that this just slides right down to and sits into, so you can see it right here. All I'm going to do is put my pin into that guy and use the pin to pull it out. We'll put that back in as one of the first things we do when we reassemble, but I wanted to point it out so you don't lose that spring now. This kit includes a safety plate, a magazine safety delete, a hammer, a sear, and one of 2 trigger options, either black or red in flat. We also include 2 over-travel set screws. You're going to primarily use the red screw, but in case of tolerance variations in frames and everything else, we have a longer set screw with the blue on it to use as well. So you're going to start with the red, and if you have to go to a longer screw, you can use the blue one. Always. Again, think of it this way. You want to take the red pill. I want to show you the difference between the factory trigger and the Apex triggers. I'm going to go ahead and pull the black one out of the way so we only have 2 to look at here. Factory trigger is aluminum. Obviously, in this case, it's black and it has serrations on the front. It's got a curved face. The Apex trigger is marked 4 on the side. Has a flat face and a smooth face as well. You'll also notice, of course, the over-travel set screw hole in the middle for the set screws to go into. Here's a side-by-side of the factory hammer and the Apex hammer. In this case, all Apex Ruger hammers have got a dimple up here for identification. So no matter what you have for a hammer, no matter what the factory's looks like, you can always tell it's an Apex by this dot on the top left corner. Here we have the safety plates. The factory component has a P stamped in the side, and it uses a red dot for the fire position and the white dot for the safe position. The Apex safety plate has a red dot for the fire position and the lasered word safe on the bottom for the safe position. Pretty easy to tell them apart. Make sure you put in the Apex when you put in the hammer and the sear. The sears look very similar, but our geometry is a bit different than the factory. Biggest identifier you can use for the Apex sear versus the factory sear is you can see the factory sear has a little sprue on it right here for the MIM process. Our sear is fully machined from tool steel, and so you won't see anything at all. We opted not to laser our name on the sear because we didn't want to affect any of the surfaces on it. So our sear is a lot shinier than the factory. It's hard chromed, and there's no sprue mark on it. So that's the Apex sear you'll want to install with our kit. I want to show you the optional component from the Apex kit. This is the magazine safety delete. it takes the place of this component here and the spring during the installation. So when you go to reinstall it, if you want to be able to dry fire your gun without a magazine in, for example, when you go to unload show clear, you could use this, you could remove this guy and put this in, and you don't have to worry about putting a magazine in to drop the hammer on an empty chamber. Just keep in mind you have to pick one or the other, you can't have both. And so when you go to do the install, we'll show the method for both parts as we go. Before I go to put the trigger in, I want to go ahead and do a little bit of prep. I'm going to go ahead and remove the blue screw out of the way because, again, we've already established we want to use the red screw primarily. I want to go ahead and put this screw into the trigger body just to give it a start so I don't have to try to do it later when it's in the trigger guard. I'll use my 16th inch hex wrench, put it in the front, and I'll screw it down till it's a little more than halfway in. I would leave maybe a couple threads sticking out of the front, and that's more than enough to give us our adjustment later. So we'll install it in this configuration, and then later we'll do the final adjustments. Go ahead and install the trigger and bar. We're going to install the trigger pivot pin as well as the bolt release and the bolt release spring all in one operation here. I'm going to take the trigger body. You'll notice on the right side of the trigger there's a recessed hole that fits over the little piece on the pin here. Drop that guy right in, and that sets aside for the time being. If you want to lubricate, you can put a little drop of oil or grease on here. That kind of gives you a little bit of lubrication. It's not super necessary because it doesn't move a lot, but it never hurts to lubricate. So put that guy in there, set her aside. Now, what we're going to do is I want to show you the ring, the pin that is the trigger pivot pin. You'll notice that on one side of the pin you've got a little small ring and then you got a big ring. That big ring locks into a spring in the frame and keeps the pin from falling out. So that has to go on the right side of the frame when it's installed. So I always install where that side of the pin goes in last. So I'll push the pin in from the right side along the smooth edge until it gets through the trigger body and then goes in the frame. I'll demonstrate now. I'm going to go ahead and drop my trigger body and bar into the frame. Where the bar sits really doesn't matter right now. It's just going to kind of float, so it's okay. I'm going to go ahead from the right side, and I'm going to take my pin with the long side in first from the right and start pushing it in. Now, if you can look inside the frame here, you can see how the pin is being stopped by the spring. So what I'll do is I'm going to put my thumb on that pin, push my pin punch down to take up the tension, and just take it off so I can just get that pin over that spring. And now it's holding it in place. I'm going to position my trigger. I can look at it from the left side. I can see my trigger positioning in that hole. And if I can align it properly, I can push that pin all the way, into the trigger body. Now, I don't want to go all the way in. I want to keep that ring that locks into the spring out for now. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit, and I'm going to make space in the frame right here for the bolt catch to go in. So now I need to put the bolt catch spring, this little guy we showed you earlier. I'm going to put that on the end of my pin punch. Just kind of set it on there. I'm going to slide it into the frame best I can. I'm going to let my finger help slide it off. Or maybe you have to use a fingernail here. There we go. And then gently push it down into its notch. It's not going to lock in. It'll just kind of sit there, which is perfectly fine. From here, I'll take my bolt catch. You'll notice the bolt catch has a little nub sticking out. I'm going to go inside the frame and stick it out through the hole. Once I'm there, I'll put my thumb on the inside to kind of hold it, and I'll pivot this guy down. If I can move it, there we go. If I can pivot it down into position, and I can use my pin punch to kind of tension against that spring. Now, all I should have to do is push my trigger pivot pin in, and there it goes. You hear that little click? That was the ring on the right side of that pin catching the spring in the frame. Now that's in place, now I have a functional bolt catch that's spring loaded, and you'll want to check this is spring loaded. Whatever you do, don't press this in and try to get it all funny. Keep the bolt on the outside. Just make sure it springs up and down. And then now I can pick the trigger bar up and install the plunger and spring that are my trigger return spring and plunger. I'll drop that guy in. Oops, almost lost it. There we go. Drop that guy in there. And I can put my trigger bar over the top. And now I have a tensioned trigger bar as expected for the rest of my assembly. So now we'll proceed on to the next step. Kind of a pro tip for you here. I went ahead and put the Sear plunger and spring in early, and I realized I have to put the Sear spring and assembly in next. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this plunger and spring back out of here, mostly because I don't need the trigger bar, I don't need to lose those pieces. Again, I hate losing parts. I hate having to do the crawling around on my knees looking for parts on the floor. So I'm going to go ahead and pull those guys out for now. We'll leave the trigger bar kind of floating as it is, and then we'll get back into that. But next, we're going to go ahead and install and tension the Sear spring into the frame. This is where we're going to also need to use an unloaded magazine, because this is going to help hold things in place when we're all done. I want to show you the orientation this guy's going to go into. As it is now, the orientation of the Sear is as it will go into the frame. So the spring, we're going to use the top end of the loop, that's going to catch right here in the notch on the top of the sear, basically in the orientation you can see here on video. And then we're going to tension that into the frame. So my method for installing this is a little bit different than others, but I think it'll work really well for what we're trying to do here. So the first thing I need to do is I need to get the sear pin and the sear itself into the frame. What I use for that is a 2-inch cross of tape. And so I just pre-made this one. It's just 2 pieces of tape, a couple inches long crossed. We're going to put this right over the sear pin to hold it in position from falling out or moving in or out. And then we're going to tension the spring. So I'll get to that. We're going to reset the frame and show you more of that in just a second here. We're going to get a little tricky in our installation now. What I need to do is I need to put the sear in, and it basically goes into the frame in this position here on the inside, obviously. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to position the sear inside, and I'm going to take my sear pivot pin, doesn't matter which side. One side has a little more bevel than the other on most, so I'll put that in from the right side to the left to capture the sear. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to position my sear in the frame. I'm going to look through the sear hole and try to align it best I can over that hole. That's going to make my life a lot easier. So you can't really see it super well on camera just yet, but I'm going to, from there, if I can see through the hole, I'm going to put my pin in from the bottom and kind of wiggle and jiggle. And then you can see here, I've basically caught the sear with the pin, and I can push this pin all the way. In this case, I can push all the way through just to demonstrate what it looks like. But we're going to back it off a bit. So from here, I'm going to look inside the frame. I want to show you the gap we're dealing with. So when I pivot the sear around, it goes in the up orientation like this. The part with the little sharp wedge goes upward toward the barrel. I need to put my spring into this notch on the left side of the frame. So what I'm going to do, and this is where the tape comes in, I'm going to use my pin punch. I'm going to push that pin back until I have it clear of the sear notch where the spring goes, right there. Now I'm going to take my pin punch and I'm going to put it in that notch between the frame and the sear to kind of wedge that in there. Now I'll use my cross of tape. I'll put on the end of that pin and I'll tape the pin in place. Now I'm going to basically squeeze the pin with the tape first to adhere to the pin and adhere it to my frame all the way around. The idea with this is that my tape is going to hold my pin when I pull this pin out of here. The tape's holding that pin from gravity falling through, or when I turn it over, from falling out. This is going to make life super easy because you won't let that pin move. Now, with that in position, now I have clear space right here for my sear spring to go in. We'll go ahead and position that and use my pliers to do that next. So here, what I have here is the sear spring sitting on the outside of the frame to identify the orientation it goes in. This sear spring is going to sit over the pivot point, which is the sear itself, the sear pin, and it's going to sit in this notch on the side inside the frame. Now, it has to be installed from the top. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and grab onto this with my pliers, and hopefully I can get a good enough hold on it. Rotate my frame up, and this is where that gap on the side of the sear is going to be your best friend. So I use my pin to kind of the spring to kind of move the sear around. I'm going to slide it into this gap here. I'm going to look on the outside, and I want to confirm I can see that spring on the outside of the frame, which you can see it there. That's the right position. Come back over here. I'm going to drop this guy back in, and it kind of sits against the frame, as you can see there. Now I'm going to use my pin punch and orient my position into the sear. Now the sear is moved toward that side of the frame, so I probably need to go ahead and flip the frame over to get myself pushed to the other side. See if I can see in here while we're working. This is why I took the plunger and spring out of the trigger bar, because it's not going to help us in this case. Get this guy in and move it in. As you can see, my sear pin is kind of pushed out of where I wanted it, so I'm going to put my pin in there and kind of give it a little bit of manipulation outward if I can. There it goes. And then I'm going to get that spring in there and try to get it in position. This is where it gets the most difficult because it's just so small, so small of a space to work in. So I'm going to give it another shot, but that's the idea. The orientation is going to be like this, basically around the sear, and where we're basically going to have to sit this little tiny arm against the inside of the sear. So I'm going to go ahead and give it another go and see if we can make it install properly. So you saw me film the last one, and I want to leave that in there. We're not going to add it to our blooper reels, mostly because I want you to see that this is actually really tough. With that spacing, I'm going to go ahead and use the gap between the sear and the frame and slide the spring in. And I'm going to make sure from the outside here that I get into that notch that's on the frame. I'm going to look back in and make sure, ooh, I think I've got it. There we go. I can see the hole for the spring. And at this point, I got to very carefully articulate my fingers around and try to push that pin up against my tape. Aha, there we go. Now I've got it in position. So before I do anything else, I'm gonna hold real tight on the back side of this pin, and I can see that I got my pin in, I got the spring where it needs to go. I'm gonna flip it up and look on the inside and confirm I'm right where I wanna be. What I'm looking for is the short leg against the sear toward the back of the loop, which is exactly where I'm at right now. So when I tension this guy, when I pick the sear up and push it forward, it's under tension like it was before. So now we can start messing with the magazine again to retension, hold it in position while we do the rest of the assembly. So we're gonna go ahead and do that next. Momentarily my sear is detensioned. I can just kind of move it around, all flopping around and stuff. That's normal. We're gonna go ahead and tension the sear now. So what I do is I take my pin punch and push it up against the spring where it just kind of sits there. Now I'm gonna use my giant fat fingers and I'm gonna push the sear forward against sear spring tension like that. Now I'm gonna take my factory empty magazine, install it from the bottom, and make sure I keep some positive tension on that sear. And as I bring the magazine in, it locks in. I can then let go of the sear. Now the sear is held under tension and the magazine's assisting. We're gonna leave the mag in for the rest of our assembly because this is gonna make life so much easier. So here's what my 2-inch cross of tape looks like after I've mangled it and done everything I'm doing. So I'm gonna go ahead and peel that guy off. It's not needed anymore. You'll notice that the sear spring is still, sear pin is still sitting up a little high. No problem. I'm gonna go ahead and just manually push it up there with my finger. I'm gonna watch it from the other side. Try not to let it go too far. If you can't easily move it, you can use a pin punch. I would recommend using the back of your pin punch off the edge of the pin so you can push it and get it flush. If you go small side in the center, you could push through, which we don't wanna do because then we have to retension it. But if you use the back off center so it'll hit the wall and the pin, now it'll stay in place. So from here, I've got the pin in place. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered as long as it's pretty sub-flush. The grips will actually keep it centered and keep it just fine. Be aware, as you're pushing on that right side, you could pop the magazine release, shoot the magazine out and detension your sear and you're back to square, oh crap. So be aware of that as you're going. Next, we're gonna go ahead and work on the hammer assembly. Next, we're going to go ahead and assemble the hammer assembly with the Apex magazine safety delete in place. So first thing with the hammer, all hammers are gonna be assembled the same. You're gonna drop the hammer, the strut into the hammer, and the little tiny top hat pin goes in there to capture it. Sometimes it'd be easier to do it from the bottom like this. You put the pin in part way, put the strut in, and then capture it all the way across. Make sure that pin sits sub-flush, or at least flush inside of its little notch here, because that's critical to function for later. At this point, I'll go ahead and hold that in place. I'll turn this guy on its back so it doesn't pop the pin out. I'll put the axle from the right side of the hammer all the way through to the left. And then I'm gonna put the Apex Mag Safety Delete onto there. That's our assembly to put the hammer back into the frame. Next thing we're gonna do is install the hammer assembly along with the safety plate and the thumb safety axle, which holds the hammer in place, as well as we have to put the trigger return spring and plunger back in place. So first thing I'm gonna do is trigger return spring and plunger. I'll grab those guys and I'm gonna put them inside the trigger body in the hole. You can kind of see right there. Just kind of drop those guys in. Now they're in position. All I have to do at this point is basically, push the trigger bar down and you can see it's tensioned. And that's all we need. For now, we'll leave that there, but be cautious. You don't want to lose those guys. Next thing we need to do is we're going to take the hammer and the safety plate and put those in the frame. Now, on the hammer, you have the axle for the hammer that has a little washer on the far right side. The trigger bar sits, oops, we'll put all that back in a second then. I'll put this back on here, just to demonstrate. This is where it goes anyway. And I'm going to put that onto the trigger bar. It's going to sit into the notch on the trigger bar all the way down. That's all it has to do. So I'm going to hold that guy on there. I'm going to go ahead and put our washer back on. And again, this is the non-magazine safety version. This is the magazine safety delete assembly version. I'm going to drop this back into the frame. Now, I have to push against the sear's tension to get it in the right position. So sometimes you have to come down and kind of angle it forward and you can feel it against the sear tension. Right now, I've got a perfect view all the way through the frame to see that, but I'm holding everything so I can't put a pin in. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna relieve that tension, kind of hold it with my thumb here. I'm gonna take my pin punch from the right side into the hammer hole, and I'm gonna try to fish it through with the hammer in place. Now this is where a smaller, like a 3/32 inch pin punch comes into play. It gives me more leeway to get that into the frame. Now I have basically a pin punch being used as a slave pin, so I can then push the other pieces in. But I'm missing using the safety plate. So I'm going to go ahead and look from the top here. I'm going to back this guy out ever so carefully so it doesn't go too far. Try to hold it in place. Now I got to drop the hammer safety plate in position and get that into that hole. So now this is where it gets a little tricky. Again, I'm trying to show you on camera, but I'm bringing it down so I can get that pin back in. It looks like, nope, didn't get it. So I'm going to reset here and try again and try to show you how it goes. So as you saw just a second ago, I was able to get a slave pin through the hammer assembly, but I didn't get the safety plate in position. And I wanted to just reconfirm for you guys the orientation of that safety plate. That's going to go just like this inside the frame, not on the outside, obviously. So one thing I want to mention too, the little washer that we're using to take up the space for the mag safety, you can put a drop of oil on that and it'll make it stick a little better. It doesn't have to be a lot, or even a little dab of grease would work, but that can help keep that in place. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hold this, hopefully where you guys can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to back this pin off ever so slightly and kind of hold on to it. And then I'm going to try to drop this guy in position. I sometimes have to hook it like back and drop it down to get it to go in. So I'm going to kind of bring that down. And am I through? I am through. So I can orient this guy. As I get the pin through, I can orient it. Now, I'll use another pin punch and kind of push on the front and bring it up. I need to have that gap in the opening to get the axle in. This is where it gets real tricky. The axle itself has these two little notches on it. And if I'm using a 3/32 inch pin punch, you can actually kind of capture just inside those notches and help guide it through. But this is going to be the hardest part of the assembly because I have to align this pin with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of material as I go in. So it's a matter of kind of wiggling and jiggling, rolling it around and pivoting around as I go push it through that hole. So it's a bit complicated, but we're going to give it a go on camera and see if we can make it work. I might get it on the first try, I might get it on the 12th try, we'll see. But the idea is to gradually use this pin, the axle, to push the pin punch out because this pin punch is acting as a slave pin. Once I get that about where it sticks out the frame, I can always back it off, and then that's when I'll put the plunger and spring back in here, and then we can continue on. So let's get started. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move my pin punch around here to where it looks like it's roughly centered in the hole. You can kind of just keep it concentric. The more concentric we are, the easier this will go through. So I'm going to try to hold it concentric best I can and start this pin into the hole and kind of wiggle and jiggle and see if I can make this guy go in properly. This can be difficult and time consuming, but don't give up. Do not hit it with a hammer, ever. This is not a hammer operation. This is a finesse thing. Oh, I seem to have moved something, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that axle back out, reorient. I'm going to try it again. So this might be something we have to do not perfectly on camera every time because of the time involved, but we're going to keep trying here for a few minutes and see if we can make it work. So I'm kind of moving things around and jiggling and kind of orienting best I can to get this guy to go in. I almost have something, maybe. I can feel it kind of starting to go. Oh, there it goes. So as it starts to move through each layer, you'll kind of feel it pop into each position. Aha! Now I'm into the hammer. So from here, I'm going to rotate. This pin is now free, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it. Now what I'm going to do is rotate my axle around to the orientation I have to catch it in. Now you can note, if you notice, the safety plate underneath is not oriented properly. I'll use a little pin punch and kind of bring that guy up into a usable position, more so I would say like that. Maybe the bottom notch matches the bottom of the frame, roughly. That should be about right. I have the small plunger and spring, the first one I warned you not to lose. These little itty bitty guys right here. They're gonna go in next. So we're gonna put that into the back of the thumb safety. I'm gonna roll this guy down into position and try to push it through more as I move it around. Now, right now it's not moving, so I need to kind of move my, oop, I dropped the plate. I can feel the sear of the hammer isn't quite right. So what I'm doing is I'm using the hammer and kind of twisting and articulating that guy around best I can, trying to get this little guy closer. What I should be able to do is the large nub here that's on the thumb safety can press against the plate, the little painted section of the plate right here. Once it's there, then I can move the plate into position. So I'm going to keep messing with this guy. I'm going to continue. If I look from the other side here, I can show you that the hammer's not fully aligned. So I'm going to go ahead and with my pin punch kind of help track it toward the center line of the hole. kind of move things around as I'm pushing in. Maybe I use the tabletop to push on it while I move that guy around from the top here. A lot of options for this. You're moving the trigger body, the trigger bar, oh, there we go, and the hammer, there we go. Now I can see the little notches coming into the frame. If I flip, I'm gonna hold this tight, flip it over. Now the extension on the thumb safety I mentioned before is against the plate, the safety plate. No problem. I'm gonna go from the top. I'm gonna put a little tension on this guy, just pushing in a little bit. I'm gonna move the safety plate up ever so gently. It's on a pivot and it's no spring load, so it's not gonna take a lot. Move that guy up as I push in. It's not moving in readily, and then I realize, aha, I don't have my plunger pushed in. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna flip this so you guys can see it better. Try to get my safety plate in an appropriate position to work. Kinda, gravity is definitely against me right now. Right about there. I'm gonna pivot my safety down and see if I can get it to engage. Aha! Engages at the bottom entirely. So now with that there, with it in fire mode, I can see the red dot through the frame. There we go. And when I put it up, I can see the safe below it. So there we go. And we also have this plunger in there, so it's tensioned. Now, from the other side, this is where I'm gonna go ahead and put the right side thumb safety paddle back on, because if I don't put this guy on, I'm gonna drop something and I'm gonna lose it, and then I'm gonna be really upset. I have to do all it over again. So as you can see, this is a quite complicated little install, but it just takes time to get it done. Once you get the thumb safety on, all the way in, a little bit of torque, doesn't have to go crazy. You might put a little blue drop of Loctite on, up to you. From here, now I can actually continue with the rest of my assembly, which is just gonna be putting my bolt release on and then my grips, and then I can do all my thorough checks. And we'll do all the full checks at the end of this video. Okay, we just showed you how to install the Apex components to take out the magazine disconnect. Now we're gonna show you how to reassemble the hammer assembly with the magazine disconnect assembly included. So, first thing we're gonna do again is install the hammer strut. I'm gonna turn it up on its side. I'm gonna put that strut in, and then put the little top hat pin through from the left side of the hammer to the right, and capture that strut and make sure it's in place. Once that's there, I'm gonna actually turn it over that way so the pin doesn't fall out on its own. Now, the magazine safety goes around the hammer like so, and we have a spring that's gonna go in on the right side, so opposite what you're seeing now, and then the axle comes in from that side as well. So the way I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna go in, once the magazine safety is in place, it holds the pin for the strut in place. So I'm gonna make sure to keep that guy covered up so I don't lose the pin. If I just lost, nope, I didn't lose it, cool. So keep that guy there, get it aligned the best I can. Now, this spring, this little, looks like a running man or something, I don't know what the heck it looks like. This guy goes in this orientation. There's a notch on the top inside right here on the, you can see it on camera. The little notch is where the spring goes. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fish this guy in between the hammer and the mag safety so that the hole in the spring lines up to the hammer hole, and then it'll drop into that little notch. So once I'm started there, I'll take my axle, I'll drop it in, push it across as best I can. Be aware, there's little rings and stuff on the axle itself, and that will sometimes catch on that spring and not let it go in. You need to be aware that the ring on the outside of this axle should sit flush against the magazine safety as you're looking at it. It should not be a gap in here. If there's a gap, move the spring around and get that guy in. Do not hammer it. It'll just push in like you saw there. But it's got to have no gap, otherwise it won't go into the frame properly. So from here, we're going to go ahead and get back into the frame and get our reassembly done. This is going to be the more complicated one because to get the hammer in, I have to get this spring in the frame first and then throw everything in place. So it's going to take a few minutes, but we're going to get it done. So I want to show you the proper orientation to install the magazine safety system. Right now I've got the top little hook facing forward, the top little wedge facing forward, and I got the spring on the right side hanging down. This notch in the frame is the spring that houses the spring for the magazine safety system. There's only an opening right here at the top, about the top 10-15%, where it's to enter from. So I have to come in with my spring at a drastic angle, come in and orient that guy in. But before I start that, I want to make sure we install the trigger return spring and plunger, because if we don't, we have to take it all apart and do it all over again. Next thing I need to do is install my trigger return spring and plunger. So I'm going to push the trigger all the way back to give it a little bit of flatness. Drop that spring and plunger into position and put the trigger bar down on it. If I pull this guy down and then release it, it could pop that plunger out. So be aware that you're not doing anything goofy like that. So I'm going to let that guy just sit there for now, and then we're going to go ahead and install the hammer system. I want to go ahead and identify the location of the thumb safety plate before we go to put it in. The hole goes over the same axle as the hammer goes into, and you've got the word safe and the red paint facing the outside. This will go inside the frame. We're going to put this in after the hammer goes in and see if we can make everything, line up properly. So let's get started. The next component to install is going to be the hammer safety plate. Remember, the hook goes forward and the letters go up to the outside and they're visible through the window in the frame. First thing I want to do is I want to catch the hook on the front over the Sear itself. So when I turn the frame up and you look inside, you can see I've got the Sear crossing the frame. I'm going to go ahead and put it in and make sure that the hook of the safety hooks over the top of the Sear. Now, the Sear is under tension, so what I'm going to have to do is look at it from the side here and try to align the hole, which you can see right here. It's not aligned, which is fine. I need to pull forward on that guy against Sear tension. So what I'm doing is I'm using my finger on the inside and I'm pulling the Sear forward and trying to align that pin, that hole, perfectly with the frame. Once I get that aligned, I'll take the thumb safety and I'll drop it in and try to capture the hole. So I basically put it in until the end of the thumb safety hits the inside of my finger. And when I flip it around and look at it, if you look on the inside of the frame here, you can see right here that I'm just barely inside the hammer safety plate. This is holding the plate in place. Now, this is taking the tension off the Sear so the magazine doesn't have to be here. So the next step is going to be to drop the hammer assembly in and go from there. At this point, I have the safety plate installed and I'm using the thumb safety to hold it in place. Now, remember, it's very tenuous where this is holding in place. The slightest bump out will pop the plate out and then I'm back to square one. So you have to be very cautious as you're moving this around not to bump this guy. With this hammer, with the thumb safety axle basically as far in just to the inside of the hammer safety plate, now we're ready to pull the magazine out because this will allow us to take tension off of the magazine safety when we put the whole assembly in. So at this point, I've confirmed I've got my hammer return spring, or my trigger return spring, excuse me, and plunger in place. My trigger bar is under spring tension. I'm going to go ahead and take my hammer assembly with the springs and everything on it. I'm going to make sure my hammer strut is down right here at the bottom and make sure I'm going to fish this spring into the frame. So what I'm going to do is pull my trigger bar up out of the way just a little bit so it's out of my way. Fish that spring in from the inside, make sure it gets that slot in the frame, and bring this guy down. Once it starts in the frame, I got to bring the trigger bar down and connect the axle to it, which is right about, oh, is that going in? There it goes. There it goes. Now, so I've got the hammer axle into the trigger bar, and I've got the spring in the frame. At this point, I'm going to lower it into the frame, and if I can see any space in that hole, that's where I want to be. So from here, now I need to get my pin punch involved and use it as a slave pin. So I'm going to take my 3/32 inch pin punch. I'm going to come in here and capture the hammer as far across as I can. So I'm going to turn this up so you guys can see it better. Now, I've got the hammer centered in the frame, and I've got the thumb safety axle holding the safety plate. So I'm going to put tension on the thumb safety, and I'm going to put my pin punch into the end of that safety. Now, I've got Sear tension pressing against the plate, and I have hammer tension on the back of the strut here. Now I just have to wiggle around the pin punch and try to align that as I press the thumb safety inward into the frame. So trying to get this where you guys can see it on camera. A little difficult, but I think I can manage. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now I've got that. As I'm moving around, it just kind of fell into place. So now the thumb safety is coming across. From here, I can show you that the bulb, or whatever you want to call it, on the thumb safety is against the frame. Now, from here, we have to back it out just a little bit because it has to pass the grip escutcheon. So I'll go ahead and back that guy off just a little bit. Rotate it around to clear the grip escutcheon. So now I'm pointing at the rear of the frame. I'm going to go ahead and turn this guy around. And I'm going to push this guy in as far as I can, pretty far, not all the way in. And now I need to align my safety plate. So the safety plate, you can see the red dot on it right now, and that's way down below where we want it. So I'm going to put my small pin punch in and kind of bring it up so I can see the word safe. I should be able to bring the bottom of that notch right above safe to the top, to the bottom of the frame. So kind of lining up the two arcs down here. Try to give you a better view of that here. There we go. So you can see the word safe through the frame. And as I press it down, we just align that guy with the bottom of the frame. Right there. That's our proper alignment. I'm going to take the little plunger and spring that controls the thumb safety. I'm going to drop that guy in the back of the thumb safety. A little tough with my big fingers here, but we should be able to get it. Come on, there it goes. Plunger and spring is in. Now I'm going to push thumb pressure in on the thumb safety. Oh, it doesn't want to go in more, so I'm going to put my finger on this and flip it over and take a look. My axle is not properly centered in the hole, which is fine. All I need to do is put a little tension on the hammer to kind of toward the way it needs to move as I'm pressing inward on the thumb safety. I don't know if you guys can see that really well or not, but let's try to get it visible for you. Once I align it, as I press in, the thumb safety should drop into place. Oh, there it goes. So now it's pushing in. It's just barely getting through the hole in the frame to right where we want it to be. So from here, I'm going to roll it back over, and I'm going to take a look. My little plunger and spring is sticking out, which is fine. I'll go ahead and hold my finger on that. I'm going to rotate this down into the fire position, and I should be able to press that plunger in with my finger. Go back down to the position I was in. Press it in and press the thumb safety toward the center of the frame and lock that guy in. Now, in this case, it's not locking in because my hammer safety plate has dropped at the front. So, easy fix. I'm going to take my pin punch on the front, pivot it up as I press inward. It was really easy to push in. Confirming on the side. Now, what I want to show you guys is that the thumb safety is now against the frame entirely. At this point, I should be good to go. Now that I have the axle and everything in place, I'm going to go ahead and stick my right side thumb safety in place, and then we'll do a bunch of function checking before we put the grips on, just to make sure everything's right. But I want to put this on so I don't accidentally knock the thumb safety out, start losing parts, or have to reassemble. So I'll go ahead and put the right side paddle on. It just sticks on the little protrusions that are on the end of this pin. I'll use my 16th inch hex wrench and screw that guy right in. And it doesn't have to have a lot of torque on it. Again, if you want to put a little drop of blue Loctite, you can. But in general, these things seem to stay on pretty well. I'll hold my thumb at the top, put a little torque on it, probably 10 inch-pounds, maybe. You don't need to use a torque wrench typically, but it's fine. It's typically fine. So now we can start doing some checks on the system. Currently, my safety is in the safe position. I'm going to go ahead and put it to fire. I'm going to go ahead and check my hammer has tension. My hammer is able to come back under spring tension. Now, I have the magazine safety in, so I have to put a magazine in for the rest of this testing. So I'll take an empty factory mag, insert it into the grip, and then we'll start doing our function checks. With the lower frame reassembled, minus the grips and the bolt release, because that goes on with the grips, that won't affect anything else here. We're going to go ahead and do a preliminary function check, and this is just going to confirm that everything has been installed properly before we do our adjustments on the over travel set screw on the trigger body itself. So, as you installed it, we went ahead and put the thumb safety on, and we've got the hammer currently detensioned. Now, because I have a factory mag safety in, I have to use a factory magazine. If I leave the factory mag safety out and use the mag safety delete, I can omit the magazine, but for this purpose and this test with this assembly, we'll have the magazine in and it won't do any harm. Again, it's an empty magazine, no ammo is present, so we don't have to worry about that. First thing I'm going to do, make sure my safety is in the fire position, down. I'm going to pull my hammer back. Now, as I pull the hammer back, it's under spring tension. I can feel plenty of force. It's going to click in to one notch. If I go all the way down, the hammer will stick, but if you press it at the front, it'll pop back to its position. It will never actually stick like this in the function of the firearm because of the way the system works. So if you get down to this point, just press it right here at the front, just in front of the axle, essentially right there. It'll pop back up. So here's where you have to be careful. You never ever want to dry fire a hammer gun with nothing on top. So we got to be real cautious. Again, as I explained before, the trigger bar is our disconnector. So if I pull the trigger, press the trigger bar down and pull the trigger, nothing happens. The hammer stays in position. I have to not touch the trigger bar when I'm messing with the hammer. So to do my test here, I want to make sure the hammer is going to drop appropriately. I need to stick my thumb on top, and I got to hold some serious force here because that hammer's got a lot of power. Pull the trigger, make sure the hammer comes forward. If it does, we're good. We're going to hold the trigger down. I'm going to pull the hammer back, and it will come back up on me as well if I don't press the disconnect. So I'm going to do this. I'll pull the trigger, disconnect it with the trigger bar, pull the hammer back, it'll click once and click a second time. That's past the first click is the safety notch. The second click is the primary sear surface on our hammer. Once you're back to this position, I'll again hold the hammer, pull the trigger, And at least we've checked that function. So that's good. Now we're going to check the thumb safety. So I'm going to pull the hammer back again, 2 clicks until it locks in. Thumb safety on. Put my thumb over it just in case it drops the hammer. Pull the trigger. No fire. Thumb safety is properly functioning. Thumb safety off. Thumb over the hammer again. Pull the trigger. Hammer is able to fall appropriately. Now we've checked the thumb safety is functioning right, and we've checked the hammer is cocking properly. From here, we're ready to begin the adjustment process on the trigger adjustment. At this point, we need to adjust the overtravel set screw. So the way I have it set up now, with the thumb safety off, a empty magazine in, thumb on the hammer nice and tight so it doesn't fall, as I pull the trigger, I can fire it. What I need to do is take my Allen wrench, use the short side, and I'm going to put it in here, and I'm going to seat it into the screw, and make sure you really get that guy seated in the screw. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put the thumb safety on at this point. That way when I press this in, I don't end up dropping the hammer by accident. You can also kind of put your fingers behind the trigger and hold here while you get the Allen wrench in place. I want to seat my Allen wrench nice and deep into the screw, make sure I'm in, and then give it a twist. About that's an eighth of a turn roughly. I'm going to go ahead and go a full quarter. And I'm going to retest. The idea is that I want to tighten the screw just enough, come on now, that I cannot drop the hammer when the safety is off. So, safety off, thumb on the hammer, pull the trigger, it still goes. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten that up some more, and then we'll continue on. So for what I've done so far, I've got the trigger over travel set screw pushed in far enough that the hammer does not fall. So I'll demonstrate that. Magazine in, thumb safety off, thumb over the hammer nice and hard, and I pull the trigger, hammer does not fall. I'm right at the verge where it could fire. So put the safety back on. I'm going to go ahead and back this guy off about an eighth of a turn until it will just fire, and then I will check it again. The idea, see this guy here, there we go, about an eighth of a turn. Now from here, I should be able to pull the trigger, and it just releases. Okay, that's what I'm calling my just released point. From here, I'm going to back off about a quarter turn, and then I'm done. That quarter turn allows enough overtravel for heat expansion in the frame and everything else to still allow it to fire. If I keep the overtravel at just barely that fire point, what's going to happen is as the gun expands and contracts with heat and environmental and dirt and everything else, you're going to have failures to fire. So you have to have that overtravel. The other thing is too, you don't want to have it like no overtravel, because if you don't get a good grip on the gun, you have issues where your finger comes off the trigger and you fail to reset and weird stuff happens. So set it where it just barely drops the hammer, and then back off about a quarter turn, and that's your set point for overtravel. Some of you are going to ask why we want to give the trigger enough overtravel, more than just the barely break even point. I want to explain here. I've got the factory hammer and Sear set up just so you can see it here. I got the hammer taped down so it doesn't move on me a lot. When you pull the trigger, the Sear sits right here. As you pull the trigger, it disengages from the hammer and pops off, right? That's the normal firing sequence. And when you reset, it comes back and it locks into the notch like so. Well, if you have too little overtravel where it barely fires, the Sear, the hammer's under incredible tension. There's tons, not tons, but there's a lot of force on that hammer pushing it forward. So as the Sear gets to the very end of the hammer hook, right there, it can tend just to go ahead and drop off. Well, if I put the Sear where it's just barely at this point, and I squeeze the trigger real hard, and I shake the gun violently, it can make the Sear drop off and the hammer drop off. Well, that becomes a damaging thing for the hammer and the Sear. You never want the hammer and Sear to just barely clear. You want to get an actual amount of clearance. I'm exaggerating here. You want to clear until let it fire and then let it retract. So we don't want to just barely pop off the corner. We want to get clear to let it fire. And that's why we go to the point where it barely fires and then give it a little bit more so it has space. This makes your hammer and Sear last essentially forever, but a lot longer than if you're just hanging on that ragged edge, because it'll eventually break that edge off and then you get a mushy trigger pull, and we don't like that. Now that we've got our overtravel set, we're going to go ahead and put the grip screws back on and do a final function check before final reassembly. First thing I need to do before putting my left grip panel back on is reinstall my bolt release. As I mentioned before, the bolt release pivots off of the escutcheon around the top grip screw. So I'm going to go ahead, and there's a hook on the back side here. That's going to hook on the bolt release itself, and then that'll just drop onto the grip escutcheon there, around the little boss there. I'll take the grip panel, set it right on. It's just pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes you have to hook underneath the little bolt release there. Get that guy on, then we'll put the screws in, and I'll flip it over, put the other screws in, and we'll come right back to you. Now that I have my grip panels reinstalled and everything is back together, we're going to do a final function check before we put the upper assembly back on. So again, I'm going to make sure my hammer is in the full cocked position. In this case, I have an empty magazine in because I have the mag safety in place. If you don't have a mag safety, you don't need a mag. Thumb safety off, thumb nice and tight over the hammer, pull the trigger, make sure it functions, pull it back, let go, make sure it hooks. Got the little overcocking there. And I'll press the trigger bar down, no function. Thumb safety up, make sure the trigger bar is up, thumb over the hammer, no function, we're good there. Thumb safety off, thumb over the hammer again, and it does drop properly. That's assembled as is. We're going to go ahead and put the upper assembly on now and then recheck that everything functions properly. Before I put the upper assembly back on, I want to remind you that the hammer has to be recocked before it goes back on. So I got the thumb safety off. I'm going to go ahead and cock the hammer back to its second click. Thumb safety on. At this point, I can put the upper assembly back on. Go ahead and drop this guy on here. Pull the mag out just in case. There we go. Now I'm locked back into position. I'm going to confirm my chamber is clear and empty. I've still got an empty magazine. So, magazine in. Thumb safety off, it dry fires. Hold the trigger down, cycle the bolt. Hold the bolt release down so the magazine's out of the way. Release for reset and re-engage. I've got another strike, so we're good. I'm going to recock the bolt, holding the bolt release down so my bolt will go forward. Thumb safety on, trigger pull, no fire. Safety off, fire. We're good to go. At this point, ready to go to the range. I just finished my function check with the magazine in, and I'm reminding myself now too that I need to check with the magazine out because I did reinstall the mag safety. So I'm going to pop that guy out. I will check the chamber is clear just to be 100% certain. Thumb safety off, pull the trigger, no function. Magazine back in, pull the trigger, bang. Okay, we're good to go. All the safeties are rechecked and functional. We're good to go. If any of this stuff doesn't work, you need to take a look inside and make sure your assembly was done properly. Though our kit is a direct drop-in and requires very little adjustment, you'll notice that this installation was relatively complex. In fact, it might be our most complex installation so far. So, if you have any problems or questions during the installation, we want to encourage you to contact our customer support, and especially if you ask a gunsmith to do the install for you. If they are having a problem or concern if it's not going exactly as the video goes, they need to contact our customer service. We are here to help. We understand the system. We understand what the parts are supposed to do. This is what we do. So contact customer service if you have any questions or need any kind of help.